One of the most common objections raised against theories about Atlantis is that if an advanced civilization truly existed in the mid-Atlantic region towards the end of the last ice age, leaving relics in various parts of the world, we would expect to see a genetic footprint of these people. As described by Plato in the Critias, Atlantis would have had a population substantially larger than the population estimates we get for contemporary Western European, Magdalenian populations, or Northwest African, Mecta-Aphilo, Ibero-Marusian people. It would be substantially larger than any populations we know of from the Near East until well into the Neolithic. So, if Atlantis existed as described by Plato, you would expect it to be a substantial demographic contributor to populations around the Mediterranean. And yes, to populations in the New World. Plato does seem to describe North and South America. He says the islands of Atlantis acted as a stepping stone to the vast continent that surrounded the true ocean being the Atlantic rather than the Mediterranean. So is the existing genetic evidence for the Upper Paleolithic in the Mediterranean consistent with the hypothesis of an advanced large population in the mid-Atlantic region? I will argue in this video that yes, the existing genetic evidence is consistent with the Atlantis hypothesis, and in fact, that evidence is best explained by the supposition of this now sunken landmass. So first of all, you can argue against the existence of a substantial landmass in the mid-Atlantic on geological grounds, and people have done so. Randall Carlson, I think persuasively, has put forward the idea that when the ice sheets were heavier towards the North Pole, this would have depressed the continental plate there, leading to a corresponding bulge at a weak spot. That weak spot would be the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. So something heavy is up here towards the North Pole that bulges up this crease along the Mid-Atlantic, leading to a substantial landmass with high mountains, as described by Plato. For the purpose of this video, let's just suppose that such a landmass did exist. It would have had a much more hospitable climate than Northwest Africa or Europe during the Upper Paleolithic. It would have been prime real estate, and if Upper Paleolithic, let's say, Aurignacian groups made it to the Azores Plateau, the land of Atlantis, I believe they would have developed into a more sophisticated culture than corresponding Upper Paleolithic, European, or Northwest African groups. There are a few reasons for that. One is that island cultures tend to develop more intense social hierarchies than mainland cultures. We see this towards the beginning, or really the resurgence of the megalithic age in the Western Mediterranean. You have advanced civilizations before the rise of Sumer in places like Malta and Crete, monumental architecture. They obviously had intense social hierarchies. They could maintain those hierarchies, I think, obviously, because people had nowhere to go. In the mainland, if you are being oppressed, you can just leave. You obviously can't just leave if you live on an island, unless you have a boat yourself. So island cultures generally lead to more intense social hierarchies. More intense social hierarchies lead to more advanced arts and technologies. That's a general feature of human civilization. You can regret that fact if you want, but where you have aristocracies, you have artisan cultures rather than just kind of home craft industries like you see in the Neolithic cultures of Southwest Europe, for example. For the most part, the Varna culture, from this region, Western Black Sea coast, is an exception, and it did have intense social hierarchies. The second reason we would expect an advanced culture to develop if this landmass existed is that the corresponding Upper Paleolithic European cultures, as far as we can tell, were the most advanced in the world technologically and artistically. You would have had a selection effect for the people who were able to make it to this landmass. Just like the IQ of white Americans is slightly higher than the corresponding indigenous European populations that they were sourced from. It takes some effort to get to a new place, so that selects for slightly higher intelligence. And then once this culture was built up, you would have had more intense social hierarchies, and you would have had dedicated artists and craftsmen in a way that you couldn't have in, let's say, Gravettian groups. Not that Gravettian artistic traditions or technological traditions were undeveloped. Like I said, they're the most advanced activity we know of, outside of perhaps Japan, during that phase of the Upper Paleolithic. A third reason why I think you would see the rise of an advanced culture if this landmass existed is that it would have allowed for an early form of slavery. If you control a series of islands, you are able to source slaves from mainland populations and restrict their movement. Without islands to assist this process, you need much more developed infrastructure to retain a slave class. The way that Plato describes Atlantis, he describes a series of 10 kingdoms that were confederated, with one kind of preeminent leading power situated on the main island of Atlantis. If we disregard the idea that these kingdoms were founded by 5 sets of twins sired by Poseidon, we could speculate that the original advanced activity happened in the mainland of Atlantis, and they were able to control local populations in Northwest Africa and Western Europe due to this kind of fortress-like ability to control populations on islands and also to escape any possible reprisal. One of the reasons castles were an important development in the medieval period was that you could go and raid your rivals and then retreat without allowing them to raid you back because you're fortified. An island offers the same kind of thing. So those are some a priori reasons that we would expect a relatively advanced culture to develop had this continent actually existed. Another point I just want to get in before we get into the genetic evidence itself is that we don't have evidence of domesticated crops. This sort of evidence, especially from a now sunken landmass, would be scarce if it's possible to recover at all. But there is an interesting ritual described on the part of the kings of Atlantis where they would use like primitive Stone Age tools to capture and slay a bull. The genetic identity of the mainland late Atlantean group I will associate with a particular Y-DNA haplotype, which itself is associated with the spread of domesticated bovines. We know that Upper Paleolithic European cultures were very sophisticated in their hunting techniques. They knew the migratory patterns. One possibility is that the Arygnacian people who knew about the existence of this warm, hospitable landmass brought infant aurochs or other animals without full domestication onto this island area where then they could hunt them as was their tradition, as maintained in the sacred rituals of the Atlantean kings themselves. So that being said, what do we see regarding the population history of the Upper Paleolithic in Europe? We'll look at this paper, The Genetic History of Ice Age Europe. Whereas the earliest modern humans in Europe did not contribute substantially to present-day Europeans. This is talking about the very earliest phase of the Arygnacian culture. all individuals between 37,000 and 14,000 years ago descended from a single founder population, which forms part of the ancestry of present-day Europeans. So all Europeans descend from a particular group of late Aurignacians. What's interesting is that this late Aurignacian population from which we are descended was displaced across all of Europe for thousands of years, only later to return. A 35,000-year-old individual from northwest Europe represents an early branch of this founder population, which was then displaced across a broad region, before reappearing in southwest Europe during the Ice Age, 19,000 years ago. So that's a little odd. The late Aurignacians were replaced by a distinct population of Gravettians. The Gravettians spread from somewhere in Russia, probably, dominating Europe for around 15,000 years, before the Magdalenian culture crops up in the Franco-Cantabrian region, primarily. The Gravettian culture was more related to Siberian populations. They were tall, 6 foot tall on average, males. They had high cheekbones. They had very advanced technology, fine textiles, probably nets for hunting, bone needles. The early Gravettian doesn't, however, display the kind of intense artistic ability of the Aurignacians, or really later Solutreans or Magdalenians. So we know that the late Aurignacian population disappears to be replaced by the Gravettian culture for around 16,000 years, only then to show back up in Spain and Western France. This population may have also returned with the Solutrean culture, which is just before the Magdalenian culture, but still, to date, we do not have Solutrean DNA. So returning to the genetic history of Ice Age Europe, thus from at least about 37,000 years ago, populations in Europe shared at least some ancestry with present Europeans. However, Goyet Q116-1, which is a late Aurignacian specimen, differs from Kostenki 14, this is an early Gravettian individual from Eastern Europe, and from all individuals of the succeeding Vestinich cluster, that is the Gravettians, in that both F3 statistics and D statistics show that it shares more alleles with members of the Elmeron cluster, that is the Magdalenians, who lived 19,000 to 14,000 years ago, than with other pre-Neolithic Europeans. Thus, Goyet Q116 has affinity to individuals who lived more than 15,000 years later, while at least half of the ancestry of all Elmeron cluster individuals comes from the Goyet Q116 cluster. And it gets more interesting, a drawing together of the ancestry of Europe and the Near East after 14,000 years ago, beginning around 14,000 years ago with the Villabruna cluster. The Villabruna cluster is also known as Western Hunter-Gatherer, one of the 3 main ancestral populations of present-day Europeans. The strong affinity to Goyet Q116, seen in Elmeron cluster individuals who belong to the late glacial Magdalenian culture, is greatly attenuated. To test if this change might reflect gene flow from populations that did not descend from the 37,000-year-old European founder population, we computed statistics. If no gene flow from exogenous populations occurred, this statistic is expected to be 0. Figure 4b shows that it is consistent with 0 for nearly all individuals dating to between around 37,000 and 14,000 years ago. However, beginning with the Villabruna cluster, it becomes highly significant negative in comparison where the non-European population is Near Easterners. This must reflect gene flow into the Villabruna cluster from a population related to present-day Near Easterners, rather than gene flow in the reverse direction, because we do not see similar patterns in earlier Europeans, although they share substantial amounts of their ancestry with the Villabruna cluster. We're going to keep looking at the Villabruna cluster in more detail A more recent study, Paleolithic DNA from the Caucasus reveals core of West Eurasian ancestry, actually models Villabruna as being more closely related, not less, to an ancient Upper Paleolithic European breakaway group. Under this model, the early Arab nations would have branched into the Goyet Q116 line, which is ancestral to the Magdalenians, and into a common West Eurasian branch, which contributed all of the ancestry of Villabruna. So genetically, the common West Eurasian is identical to Villabruna itself. And that common West Eurasian / Villabruna has Near Eastern affinities. It is closer genetically to Near Easterners, I would say, because there was a back migration from Europe during the Aregnation period to the Levant. So among Aregnation populations, you have a branch between those who back migrated to the Levant, and I would argue also migrated to the Azores Plateau. And then you have the Goyet branch, which was found in Belgium. That Goyet branch ancestry disappears from Europe for around 15,000 years, only to return with the Magdalenians. But under this model, the Villabruna branch also disappears from Europe around 35,000 years ago, only to come back to Europe 12,000 years ago. So what I see here as the best way to interpret this is that you had two distinct populations within the Aregnation that separated to some extent, although this model does have the Villabruna cluster contributing to the genetics of the Magdalenians, not vice versa. So what I see is that the Villabruna cluster, common West Eurasian, is a group within the Aregnations that populated the main island of Atlantis, became the most dominant group, and they also back migrated. That same cluster also back migrated, leading to the Levantine Aregnation, and then contributing to the later Zudzwana Upper Paleolithic Georgian individual that this paper is actually about. That Georgian individual can be modeled as 70% Villabruna cluster and 30% Basal Eurasian. This pushes back the existence of Basal Eurasian ancestry about 10,000 years from what we previously knew. Basal Eurasian ancestry was probably a result of a distinct North African migration later during the Upper Paleolithic. So the first migrations from North Africa led to hybridization with Neanderthals, the precedents of the Aregnation in the first place cropping up in the Levant. This North African early migration integrated with local Neanderthal populations, not really vice versa. The technological tradition develops out of the Mosterian, which is a Neanderthal industry. So you have the ancestors of the Aregnations in the first place. They migrate into the Near East, admix with Neanderthals, continue into Europe, and then later on, at some point, maybe around 30,000 years ago, you have another migration out of North Africa. This time, they don't admix with Neanderthals because there are no longer Neanderthals in the Near East. They instead continue on into the Zagros region, the South Caucasus region, and Iran, and they are that Basal Eurasian identity. That's why Basal Eurasian seems to have much less Neanderthal admixture. It's a North African migration deeply situated in the Near East. So this Georgian Upper Paleolithic individual is 30% Basal Eurasian, this more recent North African migration, and 70% Villabruna cluster. Or we could equally say common West Eurasian. We know that the Villabruna cluster didn't re-enter Europe directly from this Georgian Upper Paleolithic population because already more than 20,000 years ago, that Near Eastern population had Basal Eurasian admixture, whereas Villabruna cluster individuals do not have Basal Eurasian admixture. Nevertheless, there is an affinity with the Near East, I think, because of this back migration of the same ancestral group. So the direct ancestors of Villabruna split in two directions. They migrated back to the Near East, and they migrated to Atlantis. The advantage that positing their existence in Atlantis gives is that then the reintroduction of the Villabruna cluster without basal Eurasian ancestry is not surprising. And yet they would have this affinity to Near Eastern populations because the main ancestral population of all Near Easterners stems from the common ancestor of Villabruna and Zudzuana. The evidence is also consistent with a continual influx of Villabruna cluster DNA into other populations. Remember, Atlantis was a series of kingdoms. So the main kingdom would be the Villabruna cluster, and one of the other kingdoms, perhaps on another island, would be a sibling population, the Goyet 116 population, who itself did not continue to contribute substantially to the now isolated Villabruna individuals, but which did receive continual admixture from the Villabruna cluster. The Gravettians also received continual admixture from this isolated Villabruna cluster, but not vice versa. We have to posit some kind of refuge where the Villabruna cluster existed. If you put it in the Near East, then we would expect it to pick up basal Eurasian ancestry. There is also evidence of gene flow from southwest Europe into the Mecta-Aphilo people of the Ibero-Maurusian culture. This is, I think, a suppressed topic because when you search for the Ibero-Maurusian DNA, you will only see indications of indigenous North African Upper Paleolithic ancestry. However, when I dug into the actual studies that were being cited from Kefi et al., 2018, the nearest population to Taforalt, that is one of the Ibero-Maurusian sites, is Catalan, Spanish Catalan populations. The Taforalt population is also quite close to Corsicans and a number of other Southern European groups. They're actually closer to these Southern European populations than to the contemporaneous Aphilo site within the Ibero-Maurusian culture. So the Ibero-Maurusians were not demographically homogeneous. There was a European admixed component centered on Taforalt. So this looks like the Villabruna cluster throughout the Upper Paleolithic contributed DNA to Northwest Africa, to mainland Europe, and very likely to the Near East as well. The ancestors of the Villabruna cluster itself likely branched to back migrate to the Near East, but over the succeeding millennia, it's certainly possible that the Villabruna cluster could have continued to contribute genetic information to the Levant, to Anatolia, to the Caucasus. So that's how we can account for this Near Eastern affinity of the Villabruna cluster. The Magdalenian population, the Elmarone cluster, migrates back into Europe a little bit earlier than the Villabruna cluster en masse, perhaps because wherever they were primarily situated was beginning to be inundated by rising sea levels, whereas the Villabruna cluster on the main island didn't have to engage in this mass exodus. However, they did continue to contribute genetic information, as you would expect from the seat of a colonial empire, as described by Plato. Now, an interesting thing about this Villabruna cluster is that the eponymous individual, Villabruna 1, had haplotype R1b, which I've pinned with an Atlantean origin for many years. We were surprised to find haplotype R1b in the 14,000-year-old Villabruna individual from Italy. While the predominance of R1b in Western Europe today owes its origin to Bronze Age migrations from the Eastern European steppe, its presence in Villabruna, and in a 7,000-year-old farmer from Iberia document a deeper history of this haplotype in more western parts of Europe. So it's important to note that R1b was almost certainly not present or even in existence at all in the Aerugnation phase of the European Upper Paleolithic. They had much deeper haplotypes like C1a, haplotype CT, BT, Y-DNA K is also present. Now, haplotype K is an ancestor to haplotype R, so it is possible that haplotype R actually originated in Atlantis itself. We also see basal haplotype R in the Malta-Burritt culture, but that could represent a migration eastward or westward. That would be supported if we look at the data from the Canary Islands. This is another topic that seems deeply suppressed. When you look up the Y-DNA of the Guanches, they emphasize the prevalence of E1b, which is the Northwest African haplotype that is the most dominant. It was only after digging into the available paper, and the authors themselves did not emphasize this, that I found there were some other very interesting Y-DNA haplotypes in the indigenous Guanches. This isn't a modern population. These are archaeological excavated individuals from the Canary Islands. They had haplotype K, 3 individuals of haplotype K, 1 individual of haplotype P, which is the direct ancestor of haplotype R and Q. The other ancient sampling of haplotype P that I'm aware of is from northeast Russia, so it's pretty far flung. The movement of these haplotype K descended Y-DNA markers is extremely hard to follow because a single man can potentially fundamentally alter the distribution of Y-DNA haplotypes, and a single man can migrate anywhere in the world in a relatively short time. It's not easy to guess where exactly these markers originated, but we don't have to speculate an Atlantean origin to haplotype R itself. We can go ahead with a kind of Hyperborean origin of haplotype R, say that it did originate in the Malta-Burritt culture. It then branched. R1a stayed around Siberia and Eastern Europe. R1b went far afield. We know that it reached Italy by 14,000 years ago with the Villabruna cluster, but the thing is, it is certainly not the case that this Villabruna cluster individual was a recent Siberian migrant. How do we know that? The physical anthropology is not consistent with a Siberian origin. Here's the skull of Villabruna 1. So here's this 2008 physical anthropology article, The Late Upper Paleolithic Skeleton Villabruna 1, a source of data on biology and behavior of a 14,000-year-old hunter. And here's the important bit. In conclusion, the results of bivariate analyses suggest that Villabruna 1 had a relatively slender physique, intermediate in its nature between a tropically adapted constitution and a temperate adapted constitution. When compared with modern samples, the specimen shows highest similarities with North African populations. Of course, there's no evidence of gene flow from North Africa into the Villabruna cluster. The Villabruna cluster is pure genetically from its founding population that branched out of Upper Paleolithic Europe 35,000 years ago. So where then did the ancestors of Villabruna 1 become tropically adapted? Certainly not in central Siberia. So here's what I propose. An R1b lineage migrated from central Siberia across Eurasia, somehow managed to make it onto Atlantis, and then had very good fortunes on this Atlantean mainland. It only takes one adventurous, lucky male to enter into a culture and spread his Y-DNA markers. Of course, the Villa cluster is not exclusively R1b, but the earliest example of R1b we have is from Southern Europe and is already adapted to a warm weather environment. This is not what you would expect if we're talking about a recent Siberian migration. And let's go back to the genetic history of Ice Age Europe. The Villa cluster includes the largest group of samples in this study. This allows us to study heterogeneity within this cluster. First, we detect differences in the degree of allele sharing with members of the emorwoll cluster. The Villa cluster was not homogeneous across its distribution. Another paper gives 4 main kind of regional variants, and they're differentially related to the emorwoll cluster, as you would expect. So now let's look a little bit more at the Paleolithic DNA from the Caucasus reveals core of West Eurasian ancestry, Lazardus et al. Paper. The Villa cluster has been modeled as contributing to both the 30,000-year-old Vecinich and 20,000-year-old emorwoll cluster populations, suggesting that it must have existed somewhere in relatively unmixed form long before the oldest genetic data we have from it at 14,000 years ago. In QP-ADM modeling, a deeply divergent hunter-gatherer lineage that contributed in relatively unmixed form to the much later hunter-gatherers of the Villa cluster is specified as contributing to earlier hunter-gatherer groups, contributing around 35% to Gravettian DNA and as much as 60% of Magdalenian DNA, and to populations of the Caucasus, Tsudzuana around 72%. In Europe, descendants of this lineage admixed with pre-existing hunter-gatherers related to the Sungir III from Russia for the Gravettians. Sungir III is an Aurignacian era individual, so Villa plus this other branch of the Aurignacians led to Gravettian populations in this way of modeling it. Some portion of Gravettian DNA was influenced by this isolated Villa group. And Goya Q116 for the Magdalenians. So that Goya Q116 is a cousin to the common West Eurasian that's the direct ancestor of the Villa. So that cousin population existed itself in isolation from other Upper Paleolithic groups, I would say another one of the Atlantean islands, and continued to receive genetic influx from the main group of the Atlanteans, the Villa cluster. While in the Near East, it did so with basal Eurasians. Again, that can be explained to some extent by an early Aurignacian back migration into the Levant, or by a continual genetic influx across the entire Mediterranean of this isolated Villa cluster. Completely consistent with what you would expect if this large seafaring population existed in the mid-Atlantic. Later Europeans, prior to the arrival of agriculture, were the product of a resettlement of this lineage after 15,000 years ago in mainland Europe. While in Eastern Europe, they admixed with Siberian hunter-gatherers, forming the Western hunter-gatherer to ancient North Eurasian cline of ancestry. And as far as the later populations of the Near East, the highly differentiated populations at the dawn of the Neolithic were primarily descended from Villa cluster and Tsudzuana-related ancestors, with varying degrees of additional input related to both North African and ancient North Eurasian, whose proximate sources may be clarified by future sampling. So you did have a movement of the Mecta-Afalo people of the Ibero-Marusian culture through North Africa into the Natufians. The Ibero-Marusians contributed to Natufian DNA. That's that North African component. That spread with the Neolithic. That's distinct from basal Eurasian ancestry, which is that probably around 30,000 years ago migration of North Africans. This is the last of the migrations. It also represents the most deeply divergent lineage within North Africa, which makes sense because it's coming from the western extreme of the continent. The Ibero-Marusians spread into the Near East, and of course, ancient North Eurasian admixed populations continue spreading south until they get to Iran and the Caucasus. I think that movement of Ibero-Marusian people eastward does make sense with the Atlantean hypothesis. We know that the Atlanteans were pushing eastward across the Mediterranean, and if the Atlanteans had a big slave class, it wouldn't be inconsistent with the demographic patterns of slavery that they had a primary population that was the source of their slaves. That population may well have been the Ibero-Maurusians. It's interesting that all Mecta-Aphilo Ibero-Maurusian culture individuals, despite them being genetically heterogeneous, had their front teeth removed. This seems to have been a ritual thing, and perhaps the kind of ritual that you would force a slave class to go through to set them apart. They were already visually distinct in that they would have had darker skin tones than Atlanteans or contemporary European populations. So the Atlantean migrations and expansions would have likely brought some of their slave class with them. Also, when the actual war with the ancient Athens, as Plato describes it, took place, it would make sense that a slave class would try to flee to the other side's territory, just like you saw with slaves moving north during the Civil War in the US. Now, one thing we've left out so far is the genetic evidence from North and South America. And I think this is going to be hard to detect because of the nature of the Younger Dryas catastrophes. Many people now believe that a comet impact caused the Younger Dryas and would have wiped out the Clovis culture. We see a lot of Clovis artifacts and then this boundary line, which does have impact proxies in it, and then no more Clovis artifacts. So the Clovis people, if they came from Atlantis, those genetics would be largely displaced, and later Siberian migrations through Beringia would come to dominate both continents. And since Atlantis itself was destroyed at the same time, you wouldn't have continual Atlantean migration into these hard-to-reach, distant lands. From that point forward, it would have been easier to reach the Americas from Beringia. For archaeological support of the Solutrean hypothesis, I always refer to Dennis Stanford. People will tend to dismiss this without much digging because the articles you'll find at face value are extremely dismissive of this possibility. But I think the case is strong that Dennis Stanford makes, and they also make genetic arguments for a connection between some Native American populations and Europeans. Now, I wouldn't subscribe to a strict Solutrean hypothesis where the Solutrean culture migrates itself across. I would say there is an intermediate culture in the form of the Atlanteans that migrate eastward to found the Solutreans and westward to found the Clovis culture. So the first and less certain of these pieces of evidence is the distribution of haplotype R in indigenous American populations around the Great Lakes, especially in eastern Canada. Now, this is R and not R1b. However, when something is reported as a basal haplotype, sometimes that's because they didn't test any further than that. They didn't look for the distinguishing SNPs that characterize more specific subclades of the haplogroup. And when these indigenous peoples are tested more thoroughly, it's almost always R1b. Now, people will say this is because of recent European admixture, post-colonial era, but we don't see comparable levels of R1b in indigenous Latin American populations, even though we know that the Spanish interbred with natives more than anybody else. So why is there this intense concentration, up to 70% in some indigenous tribes, of haplotype R1b? Sampling will have to be done of ancient Native American groups from this region. An interesting fact that is harder to dismiss is the distribution of maternal haplotype X. Haplotype X today is only found in Europe and the Near East. It is not found in Siberia, and it's found in certain Native American groups, especially in the Great Lakes region. The mainstream hypothesis for how this came about is that mtDNA haplotype X used to be distributed throughout Siberia and went extinct. If you just look at the distribution of these haplotypes on the map, you can see that an Atlantic connection between the European and Native American distributions would be the simpler explanation. Haplotype X is found deep into the Neolithic in Spain and Turkey. You can dismiss the haplotype R as recent European admixture. You can't dismiss the mtDNA X that's been found in ancient samples. It's also hard to explain why mtDNA X in Native American populations is clustered together with the haplotype R1b in Native American populations. These are two haplotypes that are often found together in Europe and the Near East. So I wouldn't say that Native American evidence is conclusive. It's certainly highly contested. But the overall picture that we have of Upper Paleolithic genetics is consistent with the Atlantis hypothesis. That, of course, doesn't prove the existence of Atlantis, but I don't think it is fair any longer to criticize the Atlantis theory on this basis. The existing genetic evidence, in fact, supports the existence of this ancient lost civilization. I'll be coming back soon with more presentations because there is a lot of archaeological evidence that we could factor in here, as well as linguistic and mythological evidence. This topic has gained a lot of traction recently, so I want to contribute what I can to this. And hopefully, in the next few years, we will get closer to finding that hard evidence, that kind of smoking gun evidence that we would need for widespread acceptance of this idea. If you'd like to contribute to that research project, I'm starting a Discord server where people can post Atlantis-related information. So I'll put the link for that in the description. If you have any supporting or contradicting evidence as far as what I talked about today, please leave that information in the comments. Thank you guys for listening. God bless.